As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. Okay, quick trivia time. Was there figure skating in the Summer Games? Yes, it really happened, but it's also a bit of a trick question. In the early days of the modern Olympics, there were only the Summer Games, not a full separate event for winter sports. So, in the 1908 Games and the 1920 Games, figure skating was part of the overall Olympic program. Then, in 1924, the IOC held a so-called International Winter Sports Week in the French Alps that featured figure skating. That Winter Sports Week was later recognized as the first Olympic Winter Games, setting a tradition of separating cold weather and warm weather sports. MassMutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a MassMutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Mercedes took a shock 1-2 in the Belgian Grand Prix, only for the on-the-road winner George Russell to be disqualified and Lewis Hamilton promoted to first place. But how did the Silver Arrows turn around its weekend and then get its weight calculations wrong? I'm Edd Straw, and here to reveal all are Scott Mitchell-Malm, Samarth Kanal and Mark Hughes. Well, Scott, one of those unusual days. On-the-road winner didn't win. Doesn't happen very often.
No, it wasn't one of those dragged-out, awful technicalities where you're kind of frustrated at the state of F1. This was a much more black and white technical infringement, 1.5 kilos under the weight limit without fuel for Russell and Mercedes. So frustrating and a shame, because you never like to see the identity of the winner change post-race, but wasn't one of those where it was dragged out for hours and hours afterwards. I did actually... I realised this only once the news of it was a disqualification or going to be a disqualification came out, that I'd actually walked past Russell while he was on the phone just after the race. I was coming up from the paddock as he was coming out of the press conference room, and he had a face like thunder, which I only clocked after I saw him and then just said, "Oh, well done, good drive." And he sort of like looked at me like I had just like insulted him in the worst way possible, and he said, "Oh, thanks." And he was on the phone and walked off. And I thought at the time, like, that was a bit weird, but, oh, crap, I hope he hasn't had some really bad news. And obviously that phone call must have been him learning, because it was just after the press conference, that he was probably about to lose his win.
It did occur to me, that point about it happening quickly, Mark. You were here at Spa in 2008 as well, weren't you, when Lewis Hamilton had that post-race penalty, having won on the road, that handed victory to Felipe Massa, and that took ages. I remember hanging around in the paddock down there waiting for that at McLaren for ages. So it was a much cleaner one than that one.
Yeah, I suppose you can say that for it. Nobody likes to be waiting forever to know the outcome. It doesn't happen very often, thankfully. But when it does, at least it's more efficient than it used to be.
Exactly, extremely rare. And Samarth, your first F1 race you've been at, I think, where the on-the-road winner hasn't won. So that's a landmark.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I'm glad it wasn't a drawn-out process, to be honest. I think it was pretty stuck on since we saw the penalty document that it just had to be a disqualification. It's just an operational mistake, really. That's how I see it. I mean, nothing controversial. I'm sure people on Twitter will be up in arms, but that's how Twitter is, isn't it?
We should point out that as part of Samarth's remit of following F2 closely, he is no stranger to on-the-road winners losing their wins afterwards. So in a roundabout way, the junior category doing its bit as a feeder series for journalists as well as for racing drivers.
That's one very positive way to look at it. Now, Scott, as we said, Russell won on the road. He held off Hamilton and the charging Oscar Piastri. Great performance in terms of the way he played the race. But how did Mercedes make such a rudimentary error in terms of the car being 1.5 kilos underweight? What happened? How did they get it so wrong?
I'd love to give you a firm answer, but Mercedes doesn't even understand yet and wants to conduct a thorough analysis to see how it got to that point. Its initial suspicion, though, is that the fact that Russell did the one stop and there would have been obviously excessive tyre wear, more than anticipated, probably played a significant part in that. Another factor may well be that because here they go around La Source and then come back into the pit lane the wrong way, they don't do a full slow down lap, picking up marbles and adding a reasonable amount of weight to each of the tyres. It might well be as simple as the tyre wear on each individual tyre when you've run it so much longer and so much harder than you would have expected. It's a few 100 grams each, and that's all you need for it to add up to that 1.5 kilos.
Well, I did ask Xavi Pujolar, the trackside engineering boss of Sauber, about that and said here, well, how much work do you put into calculating that? And he explained, yeah, you do have to factor that in. There's possible strategies, the not getting the pickup. And he was asked, well, could that account for 1.5 kilos either way? And he basically confirmed, yes, it can do. So absolutely within that realm. And Mercedes offered no other argument or explanation. I asked Toto Wolff, was there any damage to Russell's car that could explain it? He said, no, we just think it's probably down to that, but we need to investigate.
And it's worth saying that trackside engineering director Andrew Shovlin has said that they're not going to make excuses for this. The team has said it looks like a genuine error. I think they admitted that to the stewards. And Shov's theory is that they expect it's because of that tyre wear, but yeah, they just need to get it confirmed. Either way, mistake, not good enough. They admit that, and they need to make sure it doesn't happen again.
And we should mention it's nothing to do with the amount of fuel burned, because it's 790 kilos minimum weight.
798.
798, yes, it's gone up even more. Yeah, 798 kilos.
He'd have been fine if it was 790.
Exactly, yeah. Good point. But the point I'm making is that it's without fuel, so fuel doesn't matter. That's irrelevant, although they did mention the fuel being taken out when they announced it. So that explains that. Yeah, quite a big error from Mercedes, actually. They will be kicking themselves. Very good job. They had Lewis Hamilton in second place to pick up the win. But Mark, let's actually talk about how that race played out. Multiple drivers could have won it. So how did it play out at the front?
Lewis Hamilton got by Charles Leclerc quite early in the race with a relatively easy DRS pass, and looked like he was in control of it with Piastri sitting behind Leclerc, and a big sort of DRS train behind Sergio Perez, which appeared to be preventing Verstappen from making much progress. And Russell made an early stop on lap 10, and that was the last time he pitted, because as everybody was expecting to do a two-stop race. It's traditionally a two-stop race, and all the figures from Friday suggested it was going to be a two-stop race. But after he assumed the lead at the second stops, after Hamilton and Leclerc pitted, and he just said the car felt amazing. It just felt fantastic, and the tyres were still holding on really well. And at that point, the Merc strategy machine was saying, well, you'll finish fifth if you one stop, you'll finish fifth if you two stop. And so they decided to give it a go. And funnily enough, Piastri had said a similar thing, because he'd been leading for a few laps before. And he said it, and he picked up his pace by around the second lap. And he said just felt so much better once you're in clear air. But they didn't then put that together towards changing their strategy, because at that point they believed that they were on for fighting out the victory with Hamilton if he could get past Leclerc, which they felt he could do with his tyre offset. So there was no need to gamble for Piastri on a what looked unlikely to work one stop. But hindsight says that's absolutely what they should have done, because when George did it, it worked, and basically the tyres held on long enough that he was able to just fend off Hamilton and Piastri right to the end.
Yeah, and certainly that start on the mediums, then switch to hard strategy worked exceedingly well. Toto Wolff said they just saw the performance on the hards just flatlined, and he meant that in a good way, as in it was just completely steady and completely played out. And I must admit, I don't know about you, Scott, but I thought Russell did a really good job to keep Hamilton covered in that race. There'll be a number of drivers kicking themselves for not winning it. In fact, all of them in a way will be, because the one who did win it didn't win it.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that point you make about that flatlining is really, really interesting, because I've often heard drivers or engineers in particular talk about this. You know, your ideal as a stint goes on is that you basically have kind of like negative deg or neutral deg over the course of a stint, because the tyre dropping off and fading gets cancelled out by the fuel that you're burning off. That's kind of the ideal scenario. Well, I suppose the ideal scenario is that you keep the tyres in such good nick that as the fuel drops off, you just keep getting quicker and quicker. I think in the Pirelli era, that's become almost impossible to achieve. But Russell, okay, the circumstances went in his favour on this, because I think it was widely felt up and down the paddock after this that the tyre wear was just much less than anyone expected. But Russell handled that situation really well, looked after the tyres really well, and I think he was also very clever with where he was kind of keeping something in reserve. When Hamilton caught him, I really don't think it was following through the slowest corners was clearly tricky, but where Russell was absolutely king was in those traction zones, in those really key bits, out of the chicane, out of La Source, and every single time Hamilton, they'd come out of Blanchimont, Hamilton would have that really good run all the way up from Stavelot, and he'd be within half a second, 4 tenths maybe, behind Russell going into the chicane, be quite close to him coming out. But by the time they came out of La Source and went down towards Eau Rouge, that gap was back up to sort of 7 tenths of a second. It was just enough, even with the toe and the DRS, for Hamilton to not be able to close up enough down the Kemmel Straight. So I think Russell actually judged it really well. I suspect critics of his, or people justifying that Hamilton deserved it, might say that 1.5 kilos less played a massive part in that over the course of the stint.
It could have made a difference.
It may well have helped, but I think Russell did a very good job. The only thing you would say, kind of in mitigation of Hamilton inheriting a win, is that he had also done an excellent job to be in that position and be first of the two stoppers, the first of those on the conventional strategy. That was his race to win, and we were talking about it, weren't we, early on, where I was like, Hamilton could win this, and we were expecting it to go away from him, and it never did until it did, and then it went back to him.
Yeah, and I think this was one of those races where you can look at it and come up with so many different ways that different people could have won it. There was probably, I think a Ferrari driver would have struggled, but Charles Leclerc drove such a good race, a good weekend from Leclerc. He got pole, okay, he was second fastest, but he had no business really being second fastest, even in a Ferrari. That was great, wasn't it, Samarth?
Yeah, it was excellent. I mean, it was incredibly close. I think it was like 10 seconds between the top 5, and in the fight for the final podium spot, well, as you saw, it was like just over a second. It was so close. Ferrari did not expect how close it would be. I mean, coming into the weekend, we thought, okay, Verstappen's bolted on. And then we saw he had a 10-place grid penalty. It was really wide open. To have Mercedes as the winners, so close. Really exciting. But I have to just back you up on that and say Leclerc did an excellent job today. Really excellent drive.
Yeah, there are probably 6 different cars that had the means maybe to have won the race, had the weekend panned out a little bit differently, which is really what we want to see, I think. But Mark, I suppose it's worth mentioning the Mercedes form overall. Obviously, I think this race was definitely one that if you're at the front, it was easier to win, if you see what I mean, which sounds like a stupid thing to say. But it just confirms further that this is a track that historically Mercedes have struggled at over the past few years. They weren't particularly happy earlier in the weekend, and they've managed to come away with an on the road at least 1-2. So I think that confirms how much progress they're making.
Yes, and on Friday when they were struggling, it looked like, here we go again, after being promising and winning 2 of the previous 3 races. It was looking like, here we go again. It looks like they're going to struggle to find that sweet spot that they'd hit in recent races. But they were quick to identify the problem. They changed the new floor that they put on for this weekend, but they claim that that's not the critical change, that it was just they wanted to take that out of the list of questions, as it were, and that the critical change was actually a mechanical setup issue, which cured the understeer through Sector 2. And then, once they'd got the thing back on track, if you like, it was quick again. So, yeah, it is genuinely a quick car now. But as you say, it was easier to be quick if you had the track position this weekend. It was one of those races where the tyre would work so much better if you weren't stuck in a DRS train. And so, yeah, I think it was maybe not as quick in free air as the McLaren, but it was probably the next quickest. And if it was slower, it was only by a little bit. And they were both significantly quicker than the Ferrari and probably quicker than the Red Bull too, although, as Verstappen pointed out, his would have been a very different race if he hadn't had the penalty, because he would have been able to drive his race in a very different way in terms of controlling the pace and offsetting the pace with a tyre deck.
It would have been a real red flag for Mercedes if after so many races and a couple of months of progressive updates, just constantly working, constantly getting that car into a better place, they then brought a floor upgrade trying to add downforce into the most sensitive area of the car in these regulations and instigated a bunch of problems, bouncing and balance issues in particular this weekend. But obviously, as Mark said, they don't think that's the case. The amount of changes that they made over Friday to Saturday, including the aero spec, again, as Mark mentioned, a big part of that was because of the rain forecast for Saturday. And obviously, it was really important to just have a known quantity, basically, for that. But the performance in the race, the sheer race, like that really surprised Red Bull, and it surprised Leclerc in a bad way, because he really thought Ferrari was level with Mercedes this weekend, and then in the race he just was not as quick and fell away a fair bit by the end. That showed that the changes that they made worked across the board. It wasn't just they were saved by the rain on Saturday. That car was, as Mark said, in a really good place. And if they're right, if it was a combination of a mechanical issue and the characteristics of this track that made the updated floor a red herring on Friday with those struggles, and they can bolt it back on at Zandvoort and be great, be happy with how it performs and it does what it's meant to do, then they're in a really, really good place, because they've nailed this weekend and shown how good the car is, and they can get that update back on straight away after the summer break.
3 wins out of 4 for Mercedes.
That's unbelievable, isn't it? Like, when you consider the start of the year, and it looked like they might have messed up worse than ever in this rule set, and they've actually shown that underneath all of that nastiness was a genuinely good car.
Yeah, huge amount of credit for them for doing that. And although circumstance have played their part in those wins, it's a great turnaround for that team, even if they did make a terrible error with George Russell's car. Samarth, Max Verstappen called the race one a damage limitation. He started 11th with that penalty for the engine change. That was a legacy of the Canada practice failure. You heard from him after the race. So was he content? And what do you think he could have done if he'd started from pole?
Yeah, he was really positive. I mean, he came in, it was as if he didn't miss out on a race win. It was as if he maximised everything and delivered he actually extended his points lead today. Another thing is that he's now taken the pain of that penalty. That's gone. So his home race, Zandvoort, he could fare a lot better. I think he could have won today as well. I think that was his for the taking if he'd started on pole. And he obviously secured pole position by some margin before being demoted. His pace today was excellent. Of course, it's difficult when you're behind other cars, caught in DRS trains, running with high fuel on tyres like that, and they degrade. And there was one point in the race I thought was weird where he was behind Sergio Perez, and I thought that they could have swapped them. It was just before they put Perez into the box instead. I asked Max about that. He said he was weirdly sympathetic with Sergio Perez today. I don't know if that means anything, or as if Max was just very content and very zen after a race of, as he said, damage limitation. I do think he probably could have got one more position had they swapped them pretty early and just prioritised Max. But yeah, good performance by him, and he had the pace to win. Yeah.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit-card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Right, Mark, let's talk about Sergio Perez now. He finished 8th on the road from 2nd on the grid. He did get promoted to 7th. He had that consolation point for fastest lap after a late stop, but I never liked that fastest lap point because he got that because he was at the back of the lead group and could have a free stop. So in particular, can you explain his strategy? We had a question from Daniel Ingleton from the Race Members Club, in fact, about why they brought Perez in early for his second stop. That pit stop for Hards was on lap 21 of 24. So was he also given a little bit of a difficult strategy as well?
Yeah, I mean, he had pretty mediocre pace on race day, but it was a difficult car in terms of how it was treating the tyres. The medium tyre was just really, really poor for everyone, but particularly on the Red Bull. He ran an early third. In the second stint, he was passed by Piastri. He ended up 8th on the road, having run an early third. Compromised by strategy, partly compromised by his own difficulty in adapting to the car. So I think in clear air, his pace was probably fairly decent, and certainly the qualifying performance, although it was still a chunk away from Max Verstappen, was respectable. The sort of job that you would expect of him when everything is working properly. But yeah, his race day performance very disappointing, and probably isn't going to be a help as the team discusses future.
Yeah, well, we had loads of questions about this, Scott, from Paul Blart, Mark Riley, Nick of Oz, Paul Hodgen, Tyler Hall, Daniel Ingleton and Andrew, among others. Inevitably, they focused on what Spa means for Perez's future with a decision about whether to make a change imminent. I'm going to go with one from Andrew, who says, Helmut Marko's assessment of Perez's race didn't sound very good. Do we think that's it for Perez, or just Helmut being Helmut?
No need to call Helmut names, Andrew. I think that was a little bit of Marko being over honest, shall we say, oversharing a little bit in his opinion.
What was his opinion?
His opinion was that Perez completely collapsed for Red Bull in this race, which was blunt and not untrue. It was a bad day for Perez. As good as Saturday was, it just felt like, there it was, just that bit redemption was just within his reach. Felt like he'd had a sliding doors moment of all sliding doors moments in qualifying, 0.003 of a second between being knocked out in Q2, getting to Q3, and then when he was in Q3, qualifies third fastest, gets that front row with Verstappen's penalty. It was all set up for redemption. And Red Bull set him the target or expectation of finishing on the podium. That's what they thought he should do from that position, and instead, nowhere. Falls gradually down that lead group, and I think the best way to sum up how irrelevant his race became was he had the honour, should we say, of being you might as well just pit and go for fastest lap and get us a point that way, because you're not fighting for anything and there's a big gap behind, which is always the sign of when a lead car is able to do that or has to do that, it's always the sign of a race gone wrong, really, because they're just in no man's land. So I think it's piled the pressure on Perez. It was always difficult to frame this as definitely a make or break race, but Red Bull was so 50-50, or they have been so 50-50 on changing him. They really don't want to. It's so much easier for everybody, for Perez to get everything together and be back at the form he was on at the start of the season. There was a glimpse of that on Saturday. There was a glimpse of that in the race in Hungary last week. Not here, out the window. So yeah, Marco and Christian Horner are meeting early this week. I think Marco's flying to London on Monday, and I think there's going to have to be a very serious discussion. Daniel Ricciardo had another good race for RB, didn't quite manage to... Oh no, I think he inherits a point, doesn't he, after Russell's disqualification. So yeah, so Ricciardo sneaking into the top 10, very good drive. Great timing for him. He's been on a lovely little run the last few races. Not stunningly good, but just really kind of showing that he's able to up his game, lead that team, beat Yuki Tsunoda more regularly. Just at the moment where Perez is, just unable to grab any kind of reprieve from this run of form. So Marco might have been overdoing it a little bit, but the sentiment is spot on, and he's in trouble, I think.
And I think their predicament is illustrated by the fact McLaren made a 9-point gain in the Constructors' Championship despite not having a stunning weekend. Samarth, you made a few faces when we were talking about Helmut Marko's comments. So were they faces of sympathy for Sergio Perez, of fear for his imminent fate, of that's outrageous, he did a brilliant job?
I think the painful thing, and I was making faces, thank you, Ed. I think the painful thing is when you see a driver get so close to redemption, and then the contrast between him and the redemption bit and his bad day, his bad race day, gets even worse. I mean, that almost kind of overshadows the good job he did on Saturday, and it just makes it look even worse what he did on Sunday. It wasn't good, and his mood after the race was pretty spiky, I would say. I mean, at one point, I think he snapped and said, I'm not going to say anything else about my future. It seems the pressure is getting to him, really. And, the summer break, there's so much time for them to make a decision now.
He's been talking as if this is all fictional and it's just speculation from nowhere. And it's, a media-driven narrative and agenda. But, as we've been sort of discussing between ourselves this weekend, it wouldn't be being discussed if Red Bull weren't considering it. And there's more to the Marco Horner meeting than just Perez, but it will be one of the factors. They need to work out. They are talking about it. Marco more on the record than Horner, because that's just the way Marco is.
But even Horner said it's unsustainable.
Exactly. Horner has said stuff that piles on the pressure as well. And then privately, there are various people within Red Bull who are known to have expressed frustration with the situation and expressed the need for a driver change if Perez doesn't up it. So this pressure is self-inflicted because of his form, but it's also being added to by his own team. It isn't just coming from nowhere. And I understand that Perez can't just shoot his mouth off at his team. I understand that it's kind of easy to lash out at journalists, or not lash out, maybe a bit unfair, but be a bit snide with journalists or whatever. I'm glad that he backs himself, and that he's always been quite good with his back against the wall. But I think tonally there was a bit of a shift this weekend in terms of the frustration, and I think it's because that pressure is just building. And who knows? It's going to be a massive call to drop him, but maybe we have just seen Perez's last race for Red Bull.
Yeah, it's not a great situation. I've got a lot of time for Sergio Perez. I've covered his whole F1 career, and it's one of those things that it'll be very sad if he gets dropped. It really will, because he's worked so hard to get there, and at his best he can be very, very effective. But at the same time, I can't build a case to say they shouldn't be looking at it, and there's real pressure in that team to make sure they hang on to the Constructors' Championship. So yeah, big decision coming there. Should we talk about McLaren, Scott? Because with Verstappen penalised, was this a missed opportunity for McLaren? Is second for Piastri and fifth for Norris a fair return, a good return, a disappointing return? How would McLaren feel?
No, I think mildly disappointed. Norris should have been up there with Piastri. He started in front of him, but he made a mistake at turn one. He got a weaker start. Piastri got down the inside, and Andrea Stella, the team principal, felt that Norris was maybe a little bit distracted by what was going on the inside, was a bit wider than he realised, and then I think maybe picked up a bit of understeer trying to get on the power quickly mid-corner, and he just washed out a little bit, dropped those outside wheels onto the gravel, lost a couple of places, and never got back from there. I said earlier, overtaking was a lot harder in this race than people expected. Norris was much like Verstappen. You got to a certain point and then you were basically stuck. And then on Piastri's side, even though, second on paper does look good, starting fifth, but there was a slight overshoot at the pit stop. That cost a couple of seconds. And then that had a sort of cascading effect because he caught Leclerc a little bit later. By catching him a little bit later, it meant he used a bit more tyre. That meant maybe he would have cleared Leclerc at the first go rather than the second, which cost a bit more race time. And that 3 or 4 seconds lost in total because of that is the difference between getting to the Mercedes on the last lap but not getting them close enough, getting close enough early enough to have a go, and maybe catching them with 2 or 3 laps remaining. Maybe he could have picked off Hamilton before Hamilton got to Russell. That probably would have been a bit of a stretch. Maybe he'd have just been stuck behind them and it wouldn't have made a difference. But there were imperfections on both sides in this race. Piastri, I think, did a very good job overall and was quicker. But to have gained on Red Bull in the way that they did with those 9 points, it's still something. It continues a nice trend. I think it's about actually bang on the average for the last sort of 6 or 7 races that they've taken points out of Red Bull. But I think they'll be thinking they could have had a double podium here at the very least.
Yeah, it's 42 points now, the gap, so that's less than a full complement of points. If you get one, so you get 43 points, plus the 44th if you have the fortune of getting the fastest lap point, which I still like complaining about. But so I think McLaren can probably afford to look at this and think, this was still a good outcome of a weekend, but it's just added to the pile of, the what-ifs, could we have done a little bit more? But, just another one of those weekends. Good for Piastri, though, second place. He was in the mix. Obviously, the top 3 crossed the line. Pretty much line astern. Really exciting finish as well from that perspective. So I think they'll probably take it as a gentle positive weekend on a track that wasn't ideal for them. Samarth, let's look a bit further back. Those top 4 teams were in a class of their own. We effectively then had a clean split in the field, and it was Fernando Alonso who won Class B, if we want to call it that. So how did he do that?
Yeah, really good result. 4 extra points. He pulled off a one-stop strategy. That's how he did it.
Same as Russell.
Yeah, same as Russell.
But his car was actually on the weight limit.
That too. And I think the funny thing about Alonso is that he didn't really plan on doing the one-stop strategy. He kind of just pitted on lap 14, kept going and thought, right, is there going to be a safety car? Is there going to be a safety car? There was none. I think there was one retirement this race, which actually made it even harder for people to make big gains, I would say. So Alonso thought, well, I'll just go to the end. He thought on his feet, did a good job, I think. A really good job, actually, because Aston Martin struggled with drag today. Ironically, the extra downforce and drag might have helped him take care of the tyres through corners with less sliding, so that could have helped him pull off that one stop. But good strategy. I thought it contrasted with Lance Stroll as well, who seemed a bit surly towards the end of the race, wasn't happy, was constantly complaining about drag to his engineers. It's out of character. Stroll.
Yeah, he made very little attempt to explain that after the race. He just complained about there being too much drag.
No, and his radio messages constantly had to be rebuffed, I would say, with messages of encouragement, which is not what you want to be doing as an engineer. You want to be giving actual good feedback, switch changes, things like that, actual good information, instead of trying to reassure your driver that you should keep going to score points for your team. It shouldn't be a case of motivation. Anyway, I'm sorry for that rant, but Alonso, great one-stop strategy. Nailed it. And Aston Martin should be very, very happy scoring 4 points from this weekend, I think.
Should we quickly talk about Alpine, Scott? They got a mighty 2 points for Esteban Ocon in 9th place. A fine drive from him. Was that enough to overshadow the latest round of off-track shenanigans, do you think?
No, not at all. 9th place finish for a works team, an inherited 9th, because he obviously only got the 10th on the track. Is nowhere near befitting Renault's works team in general, and it pales in comparison to a week in which we learned more about the plan to basically shut down the engine program, strike a Mercedes customer deal, and we learned that they were about to have their 3rd team boss in just over 12 months because Bruno Fairman's stepping down. So, there's loads more going on off track than there is on track. But what I would say is it's a nice little flourish for them in the context of their terrible season. To go into the summer break after 2 really bad weekends where they just found lots of different ways to underachieve. This was a little bit more like that mini run of form that they were on where they kind of got back into points contention. So good for them and good for Ocon, who I thought was really good this weekend and had the edge on Pierre Gasly, who felt like he might have had one of his Gasly-ish weekends, but he was complaining about, I think, some kind of engine issue in the race, underpowered, losing a load of time. So Might be being slightly unfair, but I do think Ocon was the quicker Alpine driver overall.
Yeah, it seemed that Gasly was struggling with temperature on his engine, which was costing him 7/10 a lap, is what he said. He was also running a higher downforce setting than Ocon, configuration really, than Ocon. So they kind of split their setups this weekend, and I think it fell into Ocon's favour, really. But Ocon, did a good job as well, so good points.
Yeah, strong weekend for him. Got into Q3 as well in that car. And good for that team because despite a few mishaps in recent races, they're pretty sharp trackside generally, and a good reward for the rank and file there. Just to add to what you said, Scott, Bruno Famin obviously is going to step down as team principal, but he is going to revert to dealing with Viri, which is obviously quite an important bit of the engine base. He says there'll be no redundancies. Everyone will be offered a job. They're going through their consultation period there. There's some very stringent French labour laws, and quite rightly so, over there. And all credit to him, I think, for rather than just walking away entirely, going back to be based at Viri and to oversee that. So, that'll be taking up plenty of time for him. Actually, Scott, Samarth mentioning Gasly power issues. Perez, there was some deployment complaining, wasn't there? You heard from Christian Horner. Was there anything to that? Do they know what that was about? Was it just not having enough charge in the battery? And if you've not got enough charge in the battery, you can't deploy it?
Yeah, I think it might have been that, because there was nothing obvious that Red Bull was immediately able to point to after the race. And you'd think after a Grand Prix like that, given the context and everything, they'd have looked for any opportunity to bail him out. So it feels they said Horner said they'd need to go over the data just to see if there was anything specific that went wrong in the race, but no, that just felt like the normal demands of a very power-hungry circuit.
Excellent. I thought it was worth addressing that just because it was one of the talking points of the race. Well, let's finish off with our usual round of questions from the Race Members Club. As always, we've had a veritable deluge, so thanks to everyone who sent them in. We'll try and get through as many as we can. And remember, if you'd like to join the questioning, you can sign up to the Race Members Club through Patreon. Mark, a question for you first from Will Witchell. What's happened to Carlos Sainz in the race? He seemed to be in prime position after starting on the hards and then vanished to a lonely 7th after passing Perez. Of course, that became 6th after the exclusion. Was it the Ferrari strategy that cost him today, or rather his own lack of pace over the weekend?
His lack of pace only really... You could criticise his pace for... he didn't get the tyre temperature on his outlap on the intermediates on his Q3, on the final Q3 run, which left him in that disappointing grid position, 7th after Verstappen's penalty, and about 6/10 off Leclerc, who did a fantastic lap in the same car. So yes, you could criticise Carlos in that regard. He just suddenly lost the feeling for the bringing the tyres up to temperature on the outlap, and that really it turned out to dominate his weekend, because that led to the choice of the hard tyre for the opening stint, which, as you say, he was going very well on. But this was before it was apparent that this was ideal circumstances, a one-stop race and not a two. So with the benefit of hindsight, you could say that although he ran longer than those around him because he was on the hard tyre, he only ran until lap 20. And we know that from Russell's performance that he could run an awful lot longer than that on the hard tyre, and that you really needed to minimise your time on the medium tyre, and because the medium tyre just wasn't good. So yeah, he was going very well indeed on the hard tyre, but then just did a conventional timing of what was going to be a two-stop race, and was for him a two-stop race. But if you could do hindsight, you would have just run much longer on that original set of hards, and then you could have probably been in a position to judge whether you could do the one-stop.
Yeah, and I think definitely the one-stop would be preferable the other way around. The medium-hard run seemed to work quite well, but yeah, if you could do it that way around, you could do it the other potentially as well. Samarth, a question from Jeremy Husted. Oliver Behrman is currently 16th in the F2 standings, and his last 2 weekends were pointless. His F1 promotion appears to be one of the least deserved in history based on junior performance. What is the likelihood that he has a short, unimpressive F1 career? There's another face going on there.
Oh, it wasn't just a face, it was a gesture. I did the thing with my hand. I wish you could have seen it. Look, I don't think it's undeserved. I think Behrman has proven himself. You know, his cameo at Saudi Arabia was brilliant. It was genuinely so impressive, and his pace has been lauded by so many corners of the paddock. It's undeniable that he deserves a call-up, and it's a good move by Haas, and I'm glad that someone is taking a move on a rookie. I will also say that he was pretty good in the F2 sprint race on Saturday. He gained 6 places on lap 1.
How was he in the feature race?
At the start.
Okay, yeah, let's get to that. So how was he in the feature race? Well, we spoke earlier about F2 penalties. Scott, I think you touched on them. He's got a 5-place grid penalty coming for the next race.
Rightly so.
Yeah, well, yeah, he kind of careered into Pepe Marti, so wasn't great. So I think there's a little defense for that. But, at the same time, it's a difficult season. There's no form for many drivers in F2 because it's such a peaky car. It's such a difficult car to set up that you're seeing teams like Prema really struggle to get on top of that. Look, there's no apportioning blame to the team or anything. I'm just saying that it's not been easy for Behrman to show his full potential there. I think he's immensely talented. It doesn't mean that he's going to have a short career in F1 just because he's had this difficult season in F2. If anything, it could make him stronger. And we've seen drivers who are not particularly amazing or standout drivers in F2 have a long career in F1. It does happen like that. Joe's got 60 Grand Prix under his belt nearly. And he was, arguably had a better run of results in F2, but and Behrman can turn it around. There's a lot of faith from him that he can turn it around and persevere with this F2 season. I don't think you can draw too much out of the struggles he's had with Prema.
Yeah, I don't think it's a particularly representative season in many ways, although I would say that Isaac Hadjar, the Red Bull driver who's on a trajectory to win the championship, he's making a very good case for himself for an RB drive next year, you could argue. Scott, Jack C says, is this result for McLaren track characteristics specific? And could you comment on the fact that Norris struggled to pass on the hards compared to Verstappen's mediums after so many laps?
Well, I still think the McLaren was probably the fastest car over in race trim. I mean, it's difficult because we didn't see what Verstappen had in full flow, but I think if you look at what Piastri managed in clear air, and I think Norris did look faster than Verstappen for the majority of the race when he was behind him, but it was just a case of they lost out in the wet conditions with their car downforce choices, and didn't quite maximise it. And then in the race, because they just had lost out a little bit on that track position, because it was so hard to pass, because the tyre wear wasn't as significant as they expected, it was just hard to make progress. So the car was still very quick here and still broadly in line with what we've seen over the last half a dozen events. Red Bull are still very fearful of this McLaren for the rest of the season and in the Constructors' Championship. So yeah, I don't think there's no major red flags over McLaren after this. It's just, and they still took points out of Red Bull. It just could have been a slightly better event if they'd optimised it.
Question I'll take from King Louis VII. Does this race change the Mercedes driver lineup ambitions? Did George Russell show Mercedes they are retaining a world champion caliber driver? And Jack Campbell on a similar note says, has George Russell once and for all shown he can lead Mercedes in the post-Hamilton era? Well, I don't think it changes the ambitions. Kimi Antonelli is still on pole position for that. There's still that hope they might be able to nick Max Verstappen. And if they get to November and they're suddenly losing faith in Antonelli suddenly and Carlos Sainz is still dithering over who he's actually going to sign for, there's a vague chance of that, but I don't think it changes anything. I think they are retaining a very high caliber driver, a potential World Championship caliber driver. There's still a bit more to prove for Russell, and I think this race individually doesn't change anything in that perspective, because for me, the difference between a world champion caliber driver and simply a very good one is they bang, 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 week after week after week after week do it. Russell's actually very, very close to doing that. There's a few little question marks, but I think they're pretty confident about George Russell, but they want 2 world champion caliber drivers in the future. They've got 2 right now, potentially, if they consider Russell in that group, and they hope Antonelli will evolve into one. They're chasing Verstappen, so yeah, they're making sure they've got all bases covered. Mark, a question from Oliver Emerson. What gave Oscar Piastri the edge on Lando Norris today? A great performance from him following last week. And in fact, he did seem a bit more comfortable, didn't he, this weekend, Piastri, than Norris?
He did, yeah. Lando was quite frank that it wasn't coming easily to him around here. He said he didn't really have the great confidence in the car through the high-speed corners. Yeah, it was just one of those weekends where it wasn't really happening. But that said, he did out-qualify. He did out-qualify Oscar, but Oscar put that right by turn 1, and basically Lando's race was finished as soon as he gave those places away after running wide in the opening seconds of the race, because it just meant he was absolutely stuck in that big long group. And really, there was no escaping from there. You saw it even with Verstappen. You get in that group, and that's it. You you can't overtake. You're not able to manage your tyres as well. The guys at the front are able to get in clear air, and they can just get a much better balance between pace and tyre management. And that's it really. Once you've made a fundamental error like that at the first turn, that's just going to make a night and day difference between your race and somebody that hasn't done that.
Samarth, we'll go on to you next for the question. We're typecasting you with these questions from Andrew Heyer, who says, is Kimi Antonelli finally figuring out F2, and will this make his F1 seat more possible?
I think Antonelli has gotten to grips in F2. He's shown really good pace, really good racecraft, and his qualifying speed has been pretty good as well. It does contrast with Behrman's tough season. I think Antonelli's got it together. Speaking of funny F2 penalties, by the way, he got a funny one today because dry ice was coming out of his car on the formation lap. Therefore, he has a 5-place grid drop for the next round.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a good one.
It's a fun one, isn't it?
Scott looks genuinely startled.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of that penalty before. It seems a little bit like punishment not fitting the crime, but who am I to question the rationale of anything that happens in that championship?
It's the second time it's happened, apparently. What is the rationale? Well, it's in the rules. We can't argue with that. So there we go. I digress. I think Antonelli is picking up the pace in F2, and we'll see some really good performances from him in the second bit of the season.
He had an absolutely mega pass in the wet sprint race.
I knew you were going to say this. You can't help yourself.
But it was so good.
It was, yeah.
It was so good. It was so. It wasn't just brave. It was so well judged. We were talking about it and we were watching through it, Ed. He doesn't overdo it on entry. He's constantly correcting the car, dancing it up over Rouge and over Radeon. So it was exquisitely judged, and it was more than just youthful inexperience, exuberance. He was pushing to get past. It was fantastic. It really impressed James Vowles at Williams as well.
I was going to say it was so good that it actually impressed other F2 team principals and engineers, and they said it was the highlight of that very, very short race on Saturday.
Yeah, everybody impressed with that one. Scott, Mark Malipard says, another race and another Lando Norris mistake, this time with car placement out of turn 1. With 5 years of experience, how does he break out of these seemingly different race start issues? Like the saying goes, no race has ever been won in the first corner, but plenty of races have been lost there.
Yeah, Stella said after the race, actually, that there is now a bit of evidence to suggest that Lando has room to improve in the early stages of races, is how he framed it, but I think we can take that to mean the start and first corner. It was another sort of slightly weaker launch, I think, anyway. And then, a misjudgment into turn 1. So he needs to work on it. But the good thing is, it is the kind of thing that, while part of it is instinctive, so you might argue it's tricky to build on this thing, it's something that I think if you kind of adjust where your focus is and you're more kind of consciously aware of the problem, then you can start sort of chipping away at it. So there'll be a little bit of process and finesse in the actual launch itself, and then where your best sort of attention is going down into turn 1. Different tracks, different corners, different starts, different situations. They all demand different things. Norris has proven many times that he can do very good starts and very good first corners. Maybe he was just caught out on this occasion. You can't make too many excuses, because to say it keeps happening might be sort of overstating it, but there is a trend emerging, and he does need to prove that he can get on top of it.
It's that thing of, if you want to be a world champion, you've got to smooth out these little rough edges, and it's really in that intensity of battle when you're at the front week in, week out that you do that. So he needs to make that step, and he knows he needs to. So that's the key thing for him. It's a question from JK, who says, given Oscar Piastri's radio message about clean air and the fact that there were barely any overtakes without a big tyre delta, can we now say that the wake has got as bad as it was with the previous generation of cars? No, I don't think we can say that. Yeah, the wake has got a little bit worse gradually as these rules have matured, but you basically had lots of cars of a similar pace, DRS trains going on as well. So it was very, very difficult for people to pass, because even though we had quicker cars behind slower cars, it wasn't by a huge margin. So ideally you want that tyre delta, but it's just very difficult, and these drivers are all very good and don't make very many mistakes as well. So it's just tough.
I think the DRS zone as well, isn't it, slightly shorter than it used to be at this track as well, 75
metres shorter.
Yeah, exactly. That makes a big difference. We don't want drive-by passes, but it did feel a little bit like even if you were sort of 5-6 tenths behind on this straight, you actually didn't have enough time with the DRS to challenge in the braking zone, which is the point of the DRS. It isn't about drive-by passes, and every it feels vanishingly rare that the DRS actually does what it's supposed to. But don't worry, one of the good things about 2026 is we're getting rid of it.
Yeah, that's a good point about the DRS. Actually, I should have thrown that one in. Valid thing to add. But yeah, it also does come back to performance differences, and they're very, very, very small. Even from the fastest to the slowest car isn't massive. Mark, a question from Ben Harwood. It looked like Red Bull set up the car to have the most downforce to perform best in Sector 2. Looking back at the race, was this the best strategy, or what should they have done?
Well, with hindsight, yes, perhaps they should have gone with a lower downforce wing, and Max may have had half a chance of getting through the pack. But as we've just been talking about, it wasn't a given that you were going to get past. They probably all should have not chosen to run a set of hards in FP1. So that there's lots of hindsight things that they should have done. But the downforce choice did have a logic. They were thinking that this was going to be a race which was going to be determined by tyre degradation, and they wanted above all else to protect the rear tyres. So in that sense, it did have a logic, but as quite often happens, the logic you have in the moment isn't necessarily the one that you have in hindsight when you know all the factors.
That's the trouble with knowledge, isn't it? You don't have it before you have it. So, Martha, question from Neil Doherty. Why wouldn't Mercedes protect the 1-2 by giving a team order for Hamilton to go past Russell?
I think there's a couple of ways into that one. I think that basically Piastri was bearing down on the pair at the end. And I was thinking the same thing. Why not swap them? Really guarantee the win there. I don't think it would have protected the 1-2, though, because I think if Piastri's bearing down, you have to swap positions at some point. And to do that, you really have to slow Russell down and let Hamilton go by safely. You can't rely on a pass down the Kemmel Straight, because Hamilton really wasn't reeling him in just as much as, that would have made it easy for him to pass for the lead. So to do that would have jeopardized Russell, because he could have fallen to third there if Piastri had caught up. I think Piastri only ended up 1.1 seconds off, but he was in DRS range at the end, I thought. Or was he not?
On the final lap.
So he was. So that could really have jeopardized that 1-2. By not swapping them, I think they protected it best in that way.
They needed to do it earlier if they were going to do it and actually protect the 1-2. Russell could have then tried to sit in Hamilton's DRS or whatever, but yeah, doing it late on wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, to be honest, I did wonder if they might do that a little bit earlier. I did raise that, but I think it's quite good that they did that. They don't really have a championship to fight for, certainly not a driver's championship, and I think actually Toto Wolff probably thought, yeah, it's better to let this one play out, and it was a really, really good effort from Russell. But Scott, there's a question from Chris Shaw. This came in before the exclusion, but it's still pertinent. Did the right driver win today? It seems that Russell's win was more down to luck than speed. Hamilton mentioned he had plenty of tyre life at the end of each stint. I think he was the best driver overall for the weekend.
Yeah, I think you can definitely argue that Hamilton was the quote-unquote right winner in a normal race. He won the Grand Prix of the conventional strategies. Russell, I don't think it was down to luck that he won on the road, because there was an element of the longer you go, the more you buy yourself time for that kind of... It's the same with safety cars, right? Like, you get a reward almost from being able to manage your tyres as long.
And he called the strategy too.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there was a lot of skill and judgment involved in what Russell did. What I would say is that Hamilton wasn't in that race with Russell because he was running the two-stop in the way that the team was managing it, on the grounds that every one of the leaders would be doing a two-stop. So Hamilton could have run the tyres longer. He could have pushed the tyres harder. Maybe he wouldn't have been quite so patient with Russell when he caught him at the end. It's not a straight comparison, because Hamilton runs his race differently if he knows how Russell's race plays out, if they have that information with the tyres. So it's tricky. The right driver win, put it this way, Russell winning on the track I thought was a good victory. Hamilton inheriting the victory because of a Russell disqualification, he's still a deserving winner. That's kind of the way I'm looking at it.
Yeah, very, very much so. I haven't done the driver rankings yet, but certainly there's a number of drivers who are all in contention for the number one spot, including Charles Leclerc, actually, who I think did a far better job than he should have done maybe with the machinery. The final question I'll take from Joe Graham. How are Mercedes able to set up a race-winning car with no dry running? What can they learn from this? Well, we've talked about the process they went through. Just to add to it, Toto Wolff did say that they tried to make some mechanical changes as well, because they weren't sure about the interaction of the aero and mechanical side, etc., but they think the upgrade worked well. But obviously, Mercedes have a huge amount of data on the pre-upgrade spec. They've been running it for the past few races, so they've got very, very well correlated models. So they can simulate, not just in the driver and loop simulator, but in all sorts of tools, a setup that works well. And I imagine they went with a kind of good, sensible setup that they knew for sure would work. Maybe they even engineered in a fraction of conservatism just to make sure. They wanted a car that was predictable and consistent in the wet in particular as well for qualifying. So they've got the tools to do that. And I think the real positive there is it tells you that Mercedes do understand their car very, very well. And that's the key thing. So I'd say, yeah, it's a combination of those tools and the fact they really, really understand the car, even at a track where they've struggled in the past, even at a track that's got a reasonable set of challenges in terms of corner speed profiles and that trade-off of drag on the straights to Sector 2 performance, etc., etc. So I think they did a very, very good job with that. And then on top of that, you've got the fact that the way the race played out, as we've covered extensively in this podcast, helped to get them to the front. And on a normal, straightforward weekend, it may have been a slightly more solid thing because I don't think the Mercedes was the quickest car. In fact, the Mercedes wasn't the quickest car. Great execution from Mercedes across the board. I'm just going to crowbar in something now because, Scott, you've been doing some news hounding today and you've dug up a very, very interesting story that will have been run not long before this podcast. So can you explain it? It's quite exciting.
Yeah, so if you've been committed to this podcast to the bitter end, a reward in the form of a news story that's quite fun. So this is very early stages. It's very tentative. Do not take this as this is definitely going to happen. It's time for us all to get super excited by it. But there is a proposal for a standalone race for young drivers at the end of the season after the season finale. It would be a couple of days afterwards in Abu Dhabi, basically following the post-season test. It would be a sprint race. It would be practice qualifying and a sprint race.
But not a championship race,
not a
Grand
championship
Prix,
race, no, fully standalone. And it's part of a wider discussion to give more track time, more opportunities for young drivers. At the moment, they have that extra car, the second car that can be run in the post-season test, and they have the mandatory FP1 outings that you have to do for each car within a team at least once over the course of a season. Beyond that, the only testing opportunities really is in old cars. Testing current cars is so limited. So it's emerged from that kind of wider discussion. My understanding is that there's broad support for the idea in principle across the teams, F1 and the FIA. So there are tons of details to work out for this. The regulations, how you do it with, how you get it outside of a budget cap, how you get it outside of engine allocation, gearbox allocation, that kind of thing. How you regulate who is eligible for it. Do you set a super license threshold if it's only an international A license? What kind of TV deal is there? What logistics are there on the ground to make sure that everyone's there to run this event a few days after the final Grand Prix of the season? But is being discussed. I think it's very interesting, and I think it would be really fun if it comes off.
Yeah, I'd love to see that happening next year. I wouldn't be surprised if it gets stymied, but it sounds like there is a real attempt to actually see if this is feasible.
Yeah,
Great.
There's no fixed timeline for it. It feels like there's too much to do to make it happen this year. Theoretically, I guess it could be possible. I think it's more likely at the end of 25, especially because we get all new cars in 26. So that's not a license for the drivers to go mad and start crashing them up at the end of 25, but you don't have to worry about like carryover of key components and that kind of thing, which 24 to 25 some teams will be trying to do.
And that's a great fun idea. Let's see how that progresses. Well, thanks to Mark, Scott and Samarth for your insight. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions as well. It is the August break now, but we're going to keep podcasting, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.